It started with a single change on the official seating chart for the state dinner at Windsor Castle, a tiny adjustment few noticed at first. But when Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, reportedly saw Lady Louise quietly moved away from senior royal placement, the atmosphere inside the palace shifted instantly. By nightfall, whispers of humiliation, betrayal, and an internal royal power struggle were spreading through the corridors of the monarchy. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. At first, palace aides allegedly tried to dismiss the alteration as nothing more than a routine protocol adjustment. After all, state dinners inside Windsor Castle are governed by an unforgiving hierarchy of titles, bloodlines, diplomatic priorities, and centuries-old ceremonial traditions. Seating plans change constantly. Names are shifted. Guests are repositioned. But according to royal insiders, this particular adjustment carried a meaning far heavier than simple logistics. Because Lady Louise was not merely moved to another section of the room. Reports suggest she had quietly been removed from a symbolic placement, from typically reserved for senior members of the working royal family, a placement many believed reflected Queen Elizabeth II's long-standing affection for Edward and Sophie's daughter. And that was where the unease reportedly began. Preparations for the dinner had already been tense for days. Palace staff were said to be scrambling through revised guest lists, rewritten ceremonial notes, and updated protocol instructions arriving at unusual hours from multiple royal households. According to whispers circulating among courtiers, confusion had started building weeks earlier when several planned appearances involving Lady Louise were allegedly altered without explanation. At the time, few questioned it publicly, but behind closed doors, some insiders now claimed there had been growing concern that Edward and Sophie's branch of the family was quietly losing standing inside the monarchy's evolving power structure. Then came the seating chart. Sources familiar with Windsor operations claim Sophie reviewed the revised arrangement shortly before final preparations began and immediately noticed Louise's new placement. Different interpretations of the moment described the Duchess as stunned, silent, and visibly shaken. One palace insider allegedly described the atmosphere around her as icy. Another claimed senior aides suddenly began avoiding eye contact altogether. Whatever truly happened inside those corridors, reports suggest the emotional impact on Sophie was immediate. Because for years, she and Prince Edward had reportedly accepted difficult sacrifices in service of the crown without complaint. They had carried out engagements with little publicity, supported the late queen through some of her most difficult years, and embraced the monarchy's demand for duty over personal ambition. Yet now, according to growing speculation, their daughter appeared to be paying the price for a royal institution rapidly narrowing its inner circle. What made the situation even more explosive was the secrecy surrounding it. Palace staff were allegedly instructed not to discuss the seating revisions publicly. Courtiers reportedly downplayed internal questions. And when journalists began quietly asking why Lady Louise's ceremonial positioning appeared different from previous major royal occasions, official responses remained vague. That silence only fueled more suspicion. Why would such a minor adjustment require so much sensitivity? Why were aides reportedly nervous about leaks emerging from inside Windsor? And perhaps most importantly, who had authorized the change in the first place? Some royal commentators now believe the issue extended far beyond one state dinner. Insiders whisper that deeper discussions had been taking place regarding the future structure of the monarchy itself, particularly as King Charles continued battling ongoing health concerns behind closed doors. With Prince William's future reign looming over every palace decision, questions surrounding who would and would not occupy meaningful royal roles had reportedly become increasingly urgent. And somewhere within those private conversations, Lady Louise's position may have quietly changed forever. By the time guests arrived beneath Windsor's towering historic ceilings, the tension was allegedly impossible to ignore. Several royal watchers later noted Sophie appeared unusually emotional during portions of the evening, while palace officials worked aggressively to maintain the appearance of perfect unity. But beneath the polished smiles and centuries-old traditions, something had shifted. Because according to multiple reports now circulating through royal circles, this was no longer simply about protocol. It was about status, legacy, visibility, and the painful realization that even loyalty to the crown may no longer guarantee protection inside the modern monarchy. But the shocking seating adjustment was only the surface of a much deeper royal conflict, one tied to inheritance, hierarchy, and the future of Edward's family inside the monarchy. Long before the cameras arrived and the state dinner descended into quiet chaos, Queen Elizabeth II had reportedly made a deeply personal promise about Lady Louise's future inside the monarchy. And according to palace whispers, that promise may now be unraveling before Sophie's eyes. For years, those closest to the late Queen quietly described Lady Louise not as the loudest or most attention-seeking young royal, but as something far more rare inside the House of Windsor, dependable. While other members of the family often found themselves trapped beneath relentless headlines, Louise reportedly became a calming presence for Queen Elizabeth during the final chapter of her reign. Palace insiders claim the young royal inherited something that a monarchy values above almost everything else: restraint. She was said to understand the unspoken rules of royal life without needing them explained. No complaints, no public tantrums, no hunger for celebrity. Just quiet loyalty to the institution her grandmother had spent 70 years protecting. That bond allegedly grew even stronger during the Queen's later years at Balmoral and Windsor, where Louise was often described by royal staff as one of the few younger royals capable of bringing genuine peace to the monarch's increasingly fragile private world. Reports suggest Queen Elizabeth saw echoes of Princess Anne in her: the same discipline, the same emotional control, the same willingness to place duty above self-interest. And within palace circles, comparisons to Anne carried enormous significance. Because Anne was not merely respected inside the monarchy. She was viewed as one of its surviving pillars, which is why whispers surrounding Louise's future role once carried such weight. According to multiple royal commentators, there had long been assumptions within palace corridors that Lady Louise would eventually become part of the monarchy's next generation of trusted working royals, not because of ambition, but because of reliability. Edward and Sophie had spent decades building a reputation as the monarchy's quiet survivors, loyal through scandal, dependable through crisis, and consistently willing to shoulder responsibility without demanding public praise in return. While other royal households dominated headlines, Edward's family often operated in silence, carrying out engagements, supporting royal charities, and protecting the institution during some of its most turbulent modern years. And Queen Elizabeth reportedly noticed every moment of it. Sources close to former palace staff claim the late monarch held enormous trust in Sophie in particular, especially during the painful collapse of Prince Andrew's public standing and the ongoing chaos surrounding Harry and Meghan's departure from royal life. At a time when the monarchy appeared increasingly fractured, Sophie and Edward reportedly became symbols of steadiness behind closed doors. Their loyalty was never flashy, it was relentless. Which is why recent developments surrounding Lady Louise have allegedly struck Sophie so deeply. Because according to royal whispers, this was never supposed to happen. But then the monarchy began changing. King Charles had reportedly become increasingly committed to the concept of a slimmed-down monarchy, a strategy designed to reduce the number of visible working royals and streamline the institution for a modern era. Publicly, the idea sounded practical, efficient, necessary even. But inside palace walls, insiders claimed the consequences were far more personal. Every reduction created winners and losers. Every reshuffled role altered long-standing expectations. And as Prince William's future reign slowly approached, speculation intensified over which royal branches would remain central to the crown and which would quietly fade into ceremonial irrelevance. That growing uncertainty allegedly placed Edward's family in an increasingly vulnerable position. Reports suggest Sophie had begun noticing subtle but unmistakable shifts long before the state dinner controversy erupted. Invitations becoming smaller, responsibilities quietly redirected elsewhere. Louise receiving less visibility during key royal events. Palace aides, according to some interpretations, started speaking less about the future role Louise might someday play inside the monarchy. And for a family that had spent decades serving without rebellion or scandal, the emotional impact reportedly became impossible to ignore. Because beneath the polished language of modernization was a far colder reality. Loyalty alone no longer guaranteed a place at the center of royal life. Some insiders now believe Sophie viewed the changes not simply as institutional restructuring, but as the dismantling of Queen Elizabeth's private hopes for Louise's future. A future that once seemed protected by tradition, trust, and years of quiet service was suddenly beginning to look uncertain, and as palace whispers grew louder, so too did fears that Edward's family was slowly being pushed toward the outer edges of the monarchy they had spent their lives defending. And as the monarchy narrowed its inner circle, one private palace decision allegedly pushed Sophie beyond quiet disappointment and into open defiance. Guests arriving beneath the glittering chandeliers of Windsor Castle had no idea a royal crisis was unfolding just rooms away. But insiders claim Sophie's expression changed the instant she reviewed the final ceremonial order and realized Louise had effectively been erased from prominence. By that stage, tensions inside the palace were already dangerously close to the surface. Reports suggest revised protocol documents had been circulating throughout the afternoon, with aides allegedly receiving last-minute instructions from senior officials tied to multiple royal households. According to palace whispers, even experienced staff members appeared unsettled by the sudden changes. Names were moved, positions adjusted, entire portions of the ceremonial order reportedly rewritten only hours before guests were expected to arrive. And buried within those revisions was one detail that immediately caught Sophie's attention. Lady Louise had allegedly been shifted behind figures considered less central to the monarchy's historic line of prominence. To the outside world, it may have seemed insignificant, just another royal seating arrangement, another carefully choreographed evening governed by centuries of rigid etiquette. But within the House of Windsor, placement is never accidental. Position is power. Symbolism is currency. And according to royal commentators now dissecting the evening, Louise's quiet repositioning may have carried a devastating message about it, where Edward's family truly stood within the monarchy's future hierarchy. What reportedly happened next remains clouded by conflicting palace accounts. Some insiders claim Sophie immediately requested clarification from senior aides overseeing the ceremonial arrangements. Others suggest the confrontation was far colder and more restrained, not explosive, but deeply personal. One palace source allegedly described the Duchess as controlled, but shattered underneath. Another claims staff members were left visibly uncomfortable after Sophie questioned why Louise's role had suddenly been diminished without warning. Whatever words were exchanged behind those private doors, insiders agree on one thing. The atmosphere inside Windsor allegedly changed almost instantly afterward, because this was no longer just about protocol paperwork, it had become emotional. For years, Sophie and Edward had reportedly accepted the monarchy's shifting priorities without resistance. They adapted during scandals, supported the crown through public crises, stepped in quietly whenever the institution needed stability, and perhaps most painfully of all, they had done so while largely avoiding the drama and attention that consumed other royal households, which is why some insiders believe the alleged downgrade of Lady Louise struck Sophie in such a profound way. Not because of vanity, but because it appeared to challenge decades of sacrifice and loyalty in a single humiliating gesture. As whispers spread through Windsor's corridors, speculation intensified about who may have authorized the change. Certain palace commentators cautiously pointed toward the monarchy's ongoing restructuring under King Charles, while others quietly suggested the emerging influence of Prince William's future court could not be ignored. Publicly, however, no senior royal addressed the controversy. Reports suggest William and Catherine deliberately kept their distance from the unfolding tension throughout the evening, refusing to become visibly associated with the dispute. To some observers, that silence was strategic. To others, it felt chilling. And then came the detail that truly ignited rumors across royal circles. Cameras covering portions of the state dinner reportedly noticed Sophie absent during moments when senior royals were expected to appear together publicly. At first, few paid attention. Royal schedules are notoriously fluid, but as whispers of the seating controversy began spreading among journalists and guests, those absences suddenly took on far greater significance. Multiple interpretations quickly emerged. Some insiders claim Sophie simply needed time away from the pressure building inside Windsor. Others allege the Duchess had come dangerously close to leaving the castle altogether before being persuaded to remain. That rumor alone sent shockwaves through palace staff, because senior royals do not casually abandon state dinners, especially not during moments of growing institutional uncertainty surrounding the monarchy itself. If true, the emotional fracture unfolding behind closed doors may have been far more serious than the public realized. And for many watching closely, The silence coming from Buckingham Palace only deepened the suspicion that something significant had shifted within Edward's branch of the royal family. Yet the deeper heartbreak wasn't just about protocol, it was about what the downgrade symbolized for Louise's entire future within the House of Windsor. Unlike other young royals chasing headlines, Lady Louise had spent years quietly embracing duty without complaint, which is why palace insiders say Sophie was devastated to see her daughter's loyalty rewarded with silence, distance, and diminishing recognition. For much of her life, Lady Louise existed in a strange position within the monarchy, close enough to the center of royal life to understand its enormous pressures, yet distant enough to avoid becoming consumed by its endless spectacle. While modern celebrity culture transformed younger royals into global headlines, Louise reportedly chose an entirely different path. No explosive interviews, no carefully managed personal brand, no hunger for attention. According to Palace Whispers, she inherited the older Windsor instinct that Queen Elizabeth herself valued most. Serve quietly, speak carefully, and never make yourself bigger than the institution. And perhaps that was exactly why Sophie believed her daughter deserved more protection from the crown, not less. Royal insiders have long described Louise as remarkably grounded despite being raised inside one of the world's most scrutinized families. Reports suggest she developed a deep appreciation for royal traditions from an early age, particularly through her pass. Ion for carriage driving, a pastime closely tied to Prince Philip and one that allegedly strengthened her bond with Queen Elizabeth during the monarch's later years. While other young figures of influence pursued public glamour, Louise reportedly found comfort in quieter royal customs, preserving traditions many feared were slowly disappearing inside a rapidly modernizing monarchy. That quiet dedication reportedly became even more meaningful to Sophie during difficult private periods within the family. Sources close to royal circles claim Louise often became a source of emotional support for her mother behind closed doors, particularly during moments when public pressure surrounding the monarchy intensified. And unlike other royal dynamics often plagued by competition or media warfare, the relationship between Sophie and Louise was said to be deeply close, built on mutual trust rather than palace performance, which is why the recent whispers surrounding Louise's reduced prominence have allegedly hit Sophie with such painful force. Because according to some palace commentators, Sophie did not simply see a protocol adjustment. She saw a warning. Comparisons between Lady Louise and Princess Anne have quietly followed her for years. Not because Louise sought power, but because she reportedly carried herself with the same reserved discipline that made Anne one of the monarchy's most respected working royals. Palace staff allegedly admired Louise's calmness during public events, her refusal to complain, her willingness to participate without demanding constant recognition. In another era, many insiders believe those qualities would have almost guaranteed a larger future role inside the institution. But the monarchy Louise inherited was no longer the monarchy Queen Elizabeth once controlled. Everything was changing. As King Charles pushed forward with plans for a slimmer, more streamlined royal structure, conversations surrounding who would officially represent the crown reportedly became increasingly ruthless behind palace walls. The debate over working royals intensified quietly but relentlessly. Every appearance mattered. Every title carried financial and symbolic consequences. And according to growing speculation, younger royals outside the direct line of succession were gradually being viewed less as future assets and more as complicated obligations within an institution desperate to modernize its image. That shift allegedly left Sophie increasingly frustrated. Reports suggest she believed Louise had done everything the monarchy ever asked of her. She had remained respectful, loyal, private. She embraced royal duty without resentment while others publicly rebelled against it. Yet instead of being elevated, palace whispers now suggested expectations surrounding Louise's future role were shrinking behind closed doors. Invitations reportedly became less significant, visibility more limited, conversations about her future increasingly vague. To Sophie, insiders claim it may have felt like watching decades of quiet loyalty slowly erased by a monarchy more focused on survival than gratitude. And perhaps the cruelest part of it all was Louise's silence. Unlike the explosive royal disputes that had dominated global headlines in recent years, there were no public complaints coming from Edward's family. No dramatic interviews. No accusations hurled across television screens. Louise herself reportedly remained calm throughout the growing controversy, refusing to fuel speculation despite mounting public sympathy. But inside palace walls, silence. IA can often carry more weight than outrage, and according to whispers now circulating through royal circles, that silence may have concealed something far more dangerous: the realization that powerful figures within the monarchy had already begun deciding who belonged in the institution's future and who did not. But while Louise remained silent, whispers inside palace walls suggested another royal faction may have been quietly reshaping the monarchy behind the scenes. As King Charles continued battling health concerns behind closed doors, insiders claimed competing royal households began repositioning themselves for the monarchy's next era. And according to growing speculation, Edward and Sophie's branch of the family may have found themselves on the losing side. For months, palace officials publicly insisted the monarchy remained stable, united, and firmly focused on duty. But behind that carefully controlled image, whispers of uncertainty reportedly grew louder with every passing week. King Charles' ongoing health struggles had allegedly created an atmosphere of quiet instability inside royal circles, forcing senior figures within the institution to think beyond the present and toward a future that suddenly felt much closer than anyone expected. And whenever succession begins dominating conversations inside the House of Windsor, alliances shift quickly. Priorities harden. Families that once appeared secure suddenly find themselves fighting to remain relevant. According to palace commentators, that changing atmosphere gave enormous momentum to one idea in particular: the slimmed-down monarchy. What had once sounded like a modern public relations strategy was now reportedly evolving into something far more serious: a restructuring of royal power itself. The institution, insiders claimed, no longer wanted a large visible network of extended royals carrying public roles. Instead, the future increasingly centered around a much smaller core built almost entirely around direct heirs to the throne. Prince William, Princess Catherine, and their children were gradually becoming the unquestioned focal point of the monarchy's long-term vision. And while publicly no hostility toward Edward's family was ever acknowledged, reports suggest the consequences of that shift quietly rippled through palace operations. Because every reduced appearance, every reassigned duty, and every carefully calculated seating arrangement allegedly carried the same hidden message: some branches of the royal family mattered more than others now. Royal journalists began noticing subtle changes first. Edward and Sophie reportedly appeared less central during certain ceremonial occasions. Louise's public role seemed increasingly undefined. Invitations and positioning during major royal moments allegedly became more restrained compared to previous years. None of it was dramatic enough to trigger immediate headlines on its own. But collectively, insiders claim the pattern became impossible to ignore, particularly for Sophie. Sources close to palace circles suggest the Duchess of Edinburgh grew increasingly frustrated as discussions surrounding the monarchy's future unfolded without meaningful mention of Louise's place inside it. For years, Sophie reportedly believed her daughter represented exactly the kind of steady, disciplined figure the crown needed, moving forward respectful of tradition, free from scandal, and deeply committed to duty without demanding celebrity-level attention in return. Yet according to growing whispers, those qualities were no longer enough to guarantee visibility within a monarchy increasingly obsessed with efficiency, hierarchy, and public optics. And beneath the polished language of modernization sat another uncomfortable reality: money. As debates over royal funding intensified privately, concerns reportedly emerged over which family members would continue receiving institutional support, public prominence, and official responsibilities in the decades ahead. The slimmer the monarchy became, the fewer positions remained available. Titles alone no longer guaranteed influence. Visibility had become competitive, strategic, carefully rationed. Some insiders even claimed palace aides quietly referred to certain non-heir royals as support figures, rather than future central players within the institution. If true, that distinction may have deeply alarmed Sophie, because once a royal family member becomes peripheral inside palace strategy discussions, reclaiming significance becomes extraordinarily difficult. Publicly, of course, royal aides denied everything. Whenever journalists questioned whether tensions existed between royal households, official responses remained calm, measured, and deliberately vague. Palace reprise. Natives insisted the family remained focused entirely on supporting the king and maintaining stability during a challenging period. But behind those statements, speculation only intensified, because the silence surrounding Edward's family felt increasingly deliberate. And according to some royal observers, silence inside the monarchy often says far more than public declarations ever could. What reportedly haunted Sophie most was the fear that Louise was slowly becoming what some insiders privately called the Forgotten Windsor, a royal raised inside the institution, shaped by its traditions, loyal to its expectations, yet gradually pushed further from its center as the monarchy reinvented itself for a new generation, not through scandal, not through failure, but through quiet exclusion. And as palace power dynamics continued shifting behind closed doors, Sophie allegedly reached a painful realization. If she remained silent now, Louise's future inside the monarchy might disappear without anyone ever openly acknowledging it had happened at all. Then came the moment that reportedly changed everything. The instant Sophie decided she could no longer quietly accept the palace's direct ion. According to multiple palace whispers, Sophie didn't storm out in anger. What stunned royal insiders was something far more chilling. She quietly withdrew, spoke almost to no one, and abandoned the state dinner with an icy composure that said more than any public statement ever could. Inside royal life, silence has always carried extraordinary power. Raised voices can be dismissed as emotional outbursts. Public confrontations create temporary scandals that eventually fade, but controlled withdrawal, especially during one of the monarchy's most carefully choreographed ceremonial evenings, sends an entirely different message. And according to insiders familiar with Windsor's atmosphere that night, Sophie's behavior left palace staff deeply unsettled precisely because it appeared so deliberate. Reports suggest the Duchess quietly stepped away from portions of the event earlier than expected, leaving senior officials scrambling behind the scenes to prevent speculation from spiraling beyond palace walls. Aides allegedly moved quickly to adjust schedules, redirect conversations, and maintain the appearance that everything remained perfectly normal. But by then, the tension inside. The royal gathering had reportedly become impossible to ignore. Guests seated near senior family members later whispered about unusually restrained conversations, forced smiles, and an atmosphere that felt far colder than the polished public image the monarchy typically works so hard to maintain. And through it all, Louise reportedly remained calm. That detail, more than any other, seemed to deepen public sympathy once rumors of the evening began spreading. According to palace whispers, Lady Louise never publicly reacted to the controversy surrounding her position during the state dinner. She did not complain. She did not seek attention. She simply carried herself with the same quiet composure royal insiders had praised for years. And for many observers, that restraint made the situation even more heartbreaking. Because while palace factions allegedly battled over hierarchy, visibility, and the monarchy's future image, Louise herself appeared to embody the exact values the institution once claimed to reward: dignity, loyalty, and humility under pressure. Which is why Sophie's silence reportedly felt so emotionally charged. Some royal commentators now speculate the Duchess understood that an explosive confrontation would only damage Louise further. Instead, her withdrawal may have been intended as something far more devastating: a refusal to participate in what she allegedly viewed as her daughter's quiet humiliation. Palace insiders claim Sophie spoke only when absolutely necessary for the remainder of the evening, avoiding extended interaction with several senior officials altogether. One source even described her demeanor as emotionally detached, as though a line had finally been crossed behind palace walls that could not easily be repaired. And standing in the middle of it all was Prince Edward. For years, Edward had carefully maintained his reputation as one of the monarchy's most dependable figures, loyal to the crown, respectful of hierarchy, and deeply committed to preserving family unity no matter how turbulent royal life became. But according to growing speculation, the events surrounding the state dinner may have placed him in an impossible position. On one side stood the institution he had spent his entire life serving. On the other stood his wife and daughter, both reportedly wounded by the very system they had defended without complaint for decades. Royal insiders now whisper that Edward's silence throughout the controversy reflected not indifference but conflict. A man caught between duty and family at the exact moment the monarchy demanded he choose which mattered more. The comparisons to earlier royal fractures emerged almost immediately. Commentators began quietly recalling previous moments when emotional distance, inside the monarchy eventually evolved into something far more dangerous: resentment, separation, and irreversible division. Yet, unlike the explosive dramas involving other royal figures in recent years, this situation carried a very different emotional texture. There were no public accusations, no interviews, no declarations of war against the institution. Instead, there was simply a growing sense of sadness surrounding a family that many believed had done everything the monarchy ever asked of them, only to find themselves slowly pushed toward the margins anyway. And once rumors of Sophie's departure began circulating publicly, sympathy for Louise surged online with startling speed. Social media users described her as overlooked, undervalued, and unfairly sidelined despite years of quiet loyalty to the My Crown. Suddenly, what began as whispers about a seating arrangement transformed into something much larger: a debate about whether the monarchy still recognized sacrifice when it came from the wrong branch of the family. But the aftermath of Sophie's silent departure would trigger an even larger debate about loyalty, legacy, and who truly matters in the monarchy's future. By the following morning, the royal seating controversy had exploded across headlines, social media, and palace commentary circles. And unexpectedly, much of the public seemed to side not with the institution, but with Sophie and Louise. What began as quiet whispers inside Windsor Castle suddenly transformed into a full-scale public debate about loyalty, hierarchy, and the monarchy's treatment of its own family members. Overnight, online discussions erupted with theories about what had truly happened behind palace walls during the state dinner. Clips of Sophie's reserved demeanor circulated endlessly. Images of Lady Louise were paired with emotional commentary describing her as ignored, sidelined, and punished for being too loyal. And perhaps most damaging for the institution itself, many people appeared, to view the controversy not as a glamorous royal scandal, but as something far more human: a mother allegedly watching her daughter quietly pushed aside by the very system they had faithfully served for years. The reaction caught palace officials completely off guard. Royal insiders claim aides initially believed the situation would disappear within hours, dismissed as another exaggerated burst of internet speculation. But instead, public sympathy intensified with extraordinary speed. Social media users began comparing Louise to other younger royals who had spent years dominating headlines through controversy, celebrity culture, and public drama. In contrast, Louise's silence suddenly became her greatest strength in the eyes of the public. People described her as dignified, hardworking, and undeserving of the treatment she was allegedly receiving behind closed doors. The narrative shifted rapidly. This was no longer about royal protocol. It became about fairness. And that shift created a serious problem for the monarchy. For years, the institution had tried to project an image of modernization built around duty, humility, and public service. Yet, according to growing public sentiment, Louise appeared to embody those values more naturally than many figures who occupied far more visible positions within royal life. Commentators across television panels and online platforms began openly questioning whether the monarchy's restructuring efforts were rewarding the wrong qualities. Why, many asked, would an institution supposedly desperate for stability reduce the visibility of one of its least controversial and most quietly respected younger royals? Royal experts soon entered the debate, and their interpretations only deepened the controversy. Some defended the monarchy's evolving structure, arguing that a smaller royal core was financially and politically inevitable in the modern era. Others, however, warned that the situation surrounding Edward's family risked creating a damaging public perception, one where loyalty and restraint were no longer valued unless attached to direct heirs. Several commentators even suggested Sophie's visible emotional withdrawal during the state dinner may have represented something larger than maternal frustration. According to palace whispers, it may have been a carefully controlled signal of disapproval directed toward the monarch, high itself, and unexpectedly many people appeared to admire her for it. Across online discussions, Sophie was praised not for rebellion, but for protection. Supporters claimed she had defended Louise's dignity in the only way still available to her inside an institution governed by silence and hierarchy. Rather than fueling chaos publicly, she allegedly communicated her pain through absence, restraint, and refusal to participate fully in what many now viewed as Louise's symbolic demotion. That interpretation transformed Sophie overnight from one of the monarchy's quieter figures into an emotional focal point of the entire controversy. Meanwhile, Buckingham Palace reportedly refused to address the issue directly. Official statements surrounding the state dinner remained tightly controlled and carefully neutral. No acknowledgement of seating arrangements was offered. No explanation emerged regarding the alleged changes to ceremonial positioning. But according to royal observers, that silence only intensified public suspicion. Because with every refusal to clarify what had happened, insider leaks continued filling the vacuum. Palace commentators claimed tensions between households had been escalating privately for months. Journalists pointed toward patterns of reduced visibility surrounding Edward's family, and gradually, a phrase began surfacing more frequently in public conversations: the forgotten branch of the House of Windsor. For many watching from outside palace walls, the emotional center of the story had become painfully clear. Edward, Sophie, and Louise were no longer being viewed simply as secondary royals navigating institutional change. They were increasingly seen as loyal figures quietly paying the emotional price for a monarchy determined to narrow itself around a smaller and more strategically powerful inner circle. And behind the palace gates, the monarchy now faced a dangerous reality. The emotional fallout from one quiet royal humiliation was no longer private. In the end, this was never just about a state dinner seat. It was about a mother watching the institution she served for decades slowly push her daughter toward the shadows and deciding, perhaps for the first time, not to stay silent about it. Behind the endless ceremony, polished statements, and carefully rehearsed appearances, the House of Windsor has always operated on an unforgiving, reality. Survival often demands sacrifice. For generations, royal family members have quietly accepted that personal feelings come second to the institution's needs. Duty before emotion, stability before individuality. But according to palace whispers surrounding Sophie and Lady Louise, something about this moment felt different, more personal, more painful. Because unlike previous royal fractures driven by scandal, ambition, or rebellion, this controversy centered around loyalty that allegedly went unrewarded. And that realization may have changed everything for Sophie. Reports suggest the Duchess of Edinburgh has privately begun re-evaluating what royal life truly offers her daughter moving forward. For years, Louise was believed to represent the monarchy's quieter future, disciplined, grounded, and deeply respectful of tradition without demanding constant public attention. Yet insiders now speculate Sophie has grown increasingly uncertain about whether the institution still has meaningful space for someone like Louise at all. Because if years of service, restraint, and loyalty could still result in gradual exclusion, what exactly was the sacrifice for? That question reported hangs heavily over Edward's family now. Some royal commentators believe Lady Louise may eventually choose to step even further away from public royal duties altogether. Not out of resentment, but exhaustion. Palace insiders claim the emotional weight of recent events exposed a difficult truth about the monarchy's modern direction. Visibility now revolves almost entirely around direct heirs and carefully managed public strategy. In that environment, quieter figures risk fading into ceremonial obscurity no matter how devoted they remain to the crown. And according to growing speculation, Sophie may no longer be willing to watch Louise slowly disappear into that silence. At the center of it all still lingers the enormous shadow of Queen Elizabeth II. For many within royal circles, the late Queen represented the last figure capable of balancing institutional survival with deep personal loyalty to every branch of her family. Her influence reportedly protected Edward and Sophie's household for years, giving them significance beyond media popularity or succession politics. But with Elizabeth gone and King Charles focused on reshaping the monarchy for a modern age, insiders claim tensions are quietly disappearing. The emotional guarantees that once held the royal family together seem increasingly fragile beneath the pressure of modernization, public scrutiny, and long-term succession planning. And nowhere is that conflict more visible than in the growing debate between loyalty and efficiency. Supporters of the monarchy's restructuring insist the institution must evolve to survive. Fewer working royals, smaller public spending, a streamlined royal core centered around the future king and his direct heirs. On paper, it sounds rational, necessary even. But critics argue the emotional cost of that transformation is becoming impossible to ignore. Because every modernization strategy creates casualties. Every narrowed circle leaves someone standing outside it. And according to many watching this controversy unfold, Edward's family may have become one of the monarchy's quietest sacrifices. Publicly, Buckingham Palace continues projecting calm unity. Official appearances remain polished. Statements remain measured. Smiles remain carefully intact. But behind those controlled images, rumors surrounding Sophie's growing frustration refuse to disappear. If anything, have strengthened her public image. Increasingly, she is no longer viewed simply as a supporting royal figure operating quietly behind the scenes. Instead, many now see her as something else entirely, a mother who finally reached the limit of what she was willing to silently endure for the institution she spent decades protecting. And perhaps that is why this story has resonated so deeply far beyond palace walls, because beneath the royal titles, centuries-old traditions, and constitutional symbolism lies something painfully human. The fear of watching someone you love become invisible. Because within the House of Windsor, titles may change, seating plans may shift, and alliances may fade, but a mother never forgets the moment her child was made to feel less than royal. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.